What's up, friends? Welcome back to the Deconstruction Zone. I'm sorry that it's been a little bit of time since we've had an episode. I know in the last one I mentioned that Emily and I are still trying to figure out our schedule, and I actually think if you know the well, that Sadie, our worship pastor, is actually be coming on a little more frequently, so I'm excited to get that rolling here in a little bit. But I am joined by people that have never been on the Deconstruction Zone, that are not a part of the well, but are podcasters and pastors themselves. And so maybe, can you guys just maybe if you were going to give a 30 to 40 second elevator pitch of who you are and what you do, would you do that for our podcasters real quick?
Absolutely. So my name's Kyle.
I'm JT.
And we are the hosts of the Progressive Pastor Podcast. We are both on staff at Concord Trinity UMC in South County, St. Louis. JT's been here on staff doing discipleship and missions for about 2 years. I'm the director of family ministry. Been here for about 9 months now. But yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Is that 30 seconds? Did I kill it?
I
think I killed it. Okay, cool.
I thought we were each going to get 30 seconds, but you can just do it. That's fine.
I can speak for you. It's okay.
You can, yeah, because you like speaking. You said you like speaking for, especially women. You like speaking for.
No, white men. You just didn't hear me correctly.
Is that what you said?
Yeah.
I've been on staff almost 3 years. I spent a year doing children's ministry before stepping into a new role, doing discipleship and missions. And yeah, it's been great. And Kyle's been on for coming up on a year now.
Getting close.
Getting close. So.
Well, so you guys, like you said this, JT, before we started, like you've seen some of our stuff on TikTok, and I think you've listened to certain things, but maybe not dove into a ton. And Kyle, I'm not sure if you've listened to much. But my flow usually with our stuff is like always through the lens of deconstruction, right? Like we want to talk about like what it is and why it matters, and how for us, like we've kind of beat the drum of like it's discipleship. It's not something that is a demonization. It's not something that's leading you away from Jesus, but it's actually, I would argue, very core to growing as a disciple of Jesus. But what I love about this room is we're kind of different stories that got us here, right? So I'm a guy who grew up in the progressive like wonderland of the Pacific Northwest in Portland, Oregon, but in kind of conservative Christianity of evangelicalism when I dipped in. Made my way to Missouri, of all places, to become a progressive, inclusive pastor. Kyle, you had mentioned like you grew up Baptist, and now you're at a church and kind of a inclusive, progressive pastor. JT, like are you from the Northeast, or you were just in the Northeast?
No, I'm from here.
You're from
here in St. Louis, and lived in the Northeast for 5 years for seminary. Did seminary in New Jersey for 3 years, and then lived in Pennsylvania for 2. Before coming back to St. Louis.
And kind of like you, like in this, I don't think you would either find this as a positive or negative, but you're like probably more of an academic, right? Like in your mind, I think you often think of things from like a cerebral academic way. You and I talked, we just recorded an episode, like we're heart people, right?
Absolutely.
And I think that might make for really interesting, and not to say you're not a heart person.
He has no heart.
Well, we don't know how to read. Right?
Exactly. Yeah.
But there is this idea in some of these conversations that we like go to one extreme, like we're head or the heart.
Yeah.
And right now we have an interesting kind of cross section of the both. And so before we dive in, I guess like when you think about deconstruction as discipleship, from your vantage point of like your experience, your academics, your spirituality, all of that in your life, is that something you initially think as discipleship, and is that different from maybe what you grew up thinking it as?
I think so. As somebody who, I describe myself as still actively deconstructing from Southern Baptist theology. I was born and raised into it, and had been in that space for 26 years of my life. I think it is, and in being in a space like the SBC, it's such a taboo term that you can't talk about.
Okay.
But some of my best conversations I've had with whether people I agree with on theology or disagree with on theology, it still comes back to this idea of deconstruction and how maybe I've differed my ideas, and some of my best conversations about the church and church world come from that mindset. But in terms of discipleship, like I have, a lot of we've had a few families and youth students that have come with my family and I to Concord down here, and have asked questions. And even like my parents, who have been in the Southern Baptist world for much longer than I have, want to ask questions about how, I've gotten to where I am
Yeah.
as kind of the more vocal of my family to kind of move down this deconstruction path. So it's interesting, and I think like I can disciple my students with that. I'm open with our current students too about that, like how, I don't always have the answers to some of these things. I'm still learning myself, but like I can also disciple like my mom and dad, which is such a weird thing to say. Like we view the patriarchal like setup of a family, and like, my dad and mom should be discipling me, and they did for a lot of years, but like now I can do the same thing back to them. But yeah,
it's not linear, right? Like it's
exactly.
like, it can be much more generative in all directions.
Yeah, and we were talking about that in our staff meeting today. Like, it's so interesting now seeing like Western culture shift, like with adult kids being like friends with their parents, and like how that's so common over in like Eastern cultures, but like, it's kind of a new thing here. So, and like I was joking, like my dad is like my best friend.
Yeah.
I love chatting with my dad. But yeah, I can teach him so much, and he's taught me so much through my life. But it stems back to these type of deconstruction discipleship. I like the way that you put that.
Yeah. So before we get to you, JT, like, so do you feel like you've been deconstructing for a long time and you felt like you've claimed that phrase, or did it take you a while to like get to a place where like you were okay with saying you're deconstructing?
I didn't have a word for it for probably for the last, I would say I've used the word deconstruction for the last like 2.5 years.
Okay.
But I've probably been going down this path for about 6 or 7 years, having questions with like inclusion in the SBC and some of the things that are very hard no's in the Southern Baptist Church, and things that I disagreed with. Now having the language to use, I realize it's been about 6 or 7 years that I've been deconstructing, but I've had the right terminology for, just a little bit now.
Yeah. Yeah, I hear that story a lot. Like I had been doing it, but I didn't know there was a word for it. We get that message a lot. JT, what about you? So like, what's your experience been?
Yeah, I mean, I had shared before, I grew up in the Catholic Church, spent some time in evangelical circles, and part of what has kind of turned me into somebody who's very academically inclined is that I kind of started this deconstructing journey through good scholarship, right? I mean, reading good biblical studies, reading good theology, hearing good historically and theologically informed sermons. And, it led me to, similar. When I would think about deconstruction, I had only ever really heard that word, at least looking, thinking like a decade ago, when we would talk about deconstructing or somebody deconstructing, it was always, it was like synonymous with deconverting, I guess, maybe, right? So like,
crazy,
and so that was the frame of reference I had for a long time for this concept. And then, me having been on this side of it, having worked through, deconstructing ideas and theology and all these things that I had either inherited or, had picked up along the way without giving it much critical thought, part of the thing that I had come to is like, we're always deconstructed. Like once it's like a snowball rolling downhill. Like we're always deconstructing and reconstructing, and we're always negotiating with our received history and our received thought and our received theology and all these things. And, and so for me, which I know, like, I think when I kind of first started, and maybe you guys had a similar experience with this, when I first started down this road of like, eventually it feels very heavy. Like we had talked before on, at the heart, we think like at the heart, most people want to be inclusive, right? But it's like, and eventually this gets very, very heavy. Like the burden feels so heavy of being like, carrying all this tradition, all this received history, all this, religion. And it just, I came to find a lot of freedom in deconstructing in terms of, I can still I can set something down and pick up something new, and I can offload this stuff that is like not useful to me or useful to my faith anymore, and still be a follower of Jesus in that. And so for me, it's like it's been this constant negotiation of, I'm going to put some stuff, I've had this stuff, or I have this thing or this idea that like, I've come to believe is harmful, or I've come to believe is not useful anymore to my faith or to the world around me, and I'm going to put that down.
Yeah.
And like, that's okay. Like, I don't need to feel shame about putting it down. I can still be a follower of Jesus. I can still be a Christian and all those things.
Emily used this example maybe on episode 1, maybe 2 or 3, maybe, but she talked about the idea of like deconstruction was described to her as like you have all this furniture in a house, kind of like the room we're in now, and deconstruction is taking all of that out. And we had later come to talk about like in the reconstruction is like deciding what you bring back in,
right?
And it's like you're decorating the house for yourself. Like you think about when you move into a furnished apartment, or you move into your college dorm, or even you really move into your first place as an adult, like your parents still kind of help you do that, right? And they're like you're putting on the things that you think you were supposed to have. And deconstruction is a lot of that, like putting down the things you were given, or taking the things out of the room that never fit to begin with, and being able to really start to build a faith that is your own. But it's not like discipleship in general is not always fun. Like there's times you feel stretched and times you feel frustrated, and deconstruction can be painful. That's one of the common things in the DMs and the emails we get is like our listeners some are on the other side of it, and they can retrospectively look back and be like, I'm so happy and healthy now. But a lot of people are in the midst of it, and like, this is the most painful thing, and I see no light at the end of the tunnel. I see no other side. And all the voices around me are telling me there's no other side. And maybe as like a word of encouragement, but also just like honesty and vulnerability. Like, have you had painful seasons of deconstruction? And like, what was maybe something that was really hard or difficult or painful to deconstruct, like for you guys in that?
I'll start out. Excuse me. Can you just edit that out? Just edit out that cough for me.
Oh, we're gonna leave it in.
It'll be our new intro music.
There you go. Yeah, let's just remix it. No, when you were asking that question, memory immediately popped up, and I had talked about this in a sermon not too long ago here at Concord, and there was a time when I was in seminary. I was like, in the trenches of my second year, just starting to see like a pinprick of light at the end of my educational tunnel. And I remember I was in my like grad student apartment, and my wife was out, whatever, I was there alone. And it was right at like the height of the Syrian refugee crisis. And we were like, there were videos and pictures of like dead kids washing up on beaches. And like, and I really struggled with like, this is happening. People are dying. I don't know. And I'm like sitting in this apartment writing this paper about this high level theoretical theology, whatever. Right. And it's like, and I really struggled in that moment, both with like, and all of this is against the backdrop of, grew up in St. Louis, the murder of Michael Brown happened, 15 minutes from where I, and I came from that world into seminary, and now, you're seeing this kind of these global crises, and like, I was just ready, like I was ready to be an atheist. Like I was just ready to be done. I was like, I just can't keep doing, I can't keep doing this and like trying to think about life after seminary and ministry and like going about my happy way while this is happening, and trying to make sense of this classic question of theodicy, this classic question of how do we, how does a good God let bad things happen to innocent,
So even as like an academic, like part of your deconstruction was like letting go of the academics of it sounds like, right?
Yeah. I mean, like, because I had, and still, I think depending on how that question gets framed, I still never found a sufficient answer to the classic question, right? Of like, why does God? Now, within that question assumes a lot about, who God is, what type of what type of God is, the way
and the
God
question you're
interacts
asking is
with
like,
the
why do
world.
bad things happen to good people?
Right. Yeah. Like why do bad things happen to good people? Why, we've heard a lot like why does God allow bad things happen? And it's like so there's a lot of assumptions in that question that we would have to parse out. But at the time I was like really struggling with this, and I remember getting up and walking like from my kitchen to my living room to just like sit down because I just couldn't work on this stuff anymore. And in that little like 10-foot journey, this is like the only time I'd ever experienced something that I would classify it that felt like a supernatural or like a metaphysical experience, where I felt this phrase or these words like flash across my mind of faith happens to you. And like never before in my work, in my reading and all my research had I come across that like formulation or like what that meant to me. And I would kind of stop me in my tracks, and I was thinking like, eventually what I kind of came to realize was, or how I came to interpret that experience was like, even if I let go of all of this stuff, even if I let go of Jesus, even if I let go of faith, Jesus isn't going to let go of me. And so it's like, that was a big step in my process of like, and I think there was stuff in my own as like, I was, idolizing, the academic study of religion was supplanting my lived expression of faith. Like there were things there too, but I was like, part of that for me was letting go of the idea that I need to have an academic explanation for these things. And I just need to allow myself to experience the pain of what's happening in the world and figure out how I can lend myself to the solution of that.
So you're saying you should let go and let God?
I will say
You need to stop.
early on in the podcast, and I've walked this back a little bit, but I remember saying early on to Emily that I thought academia was one of the greatest tools of the devil.
Ooh, preach it.
I don't necessarily disagree
to
an extent. Yeah.
I've walked it back a little bit, but that was part. And again, this is my bias as a heart guy. But I was like, it's giving people what appears to be a sterile way to classify everything, but then you can't really, and you end up there. And I bet your story is a lot like other people. But what about you, Kyle? Like, what's your situation? What's been difficult? What's been hard?
I mean, I think the hardest process for me, I think, was just letting go of. So, when I started my ministry at my home church that I grew up in, which has its challenges of its own. So, staying in the SBC, I was really excited about that. When I took the position, I was still a college student when I was doing it, starting on an interim basis. And, when I took the position, I was like, oh, I get this awesome job and this awesome church that I know really well. I know other people. I was like, I'm just going to retire here. Like, this is it, guys. Like, I figured it out. Like, I'm 20, like, got my retirement plan. Like, I'm done. And I was like, this is going to be so easy. And then, like, you get into it and you're like, oh, I have the challenges of all the people here remember me as, bratty little 13-year-old Kyle who put his knee in the wall playing ping pong. So they're not going to respect me as an adult, but also you're 20-year-old Kyle and you should be doing significantly better than what you're doing, even though you're a full-time student and trying to work this full-time job and getting married. So like, why don't you like step up and figure it out? Yeah. So it was this really weird balance of trying to figure that out. So by that point, this institution that I loved, was my idea of the church. Like that was the church because it was my church. And so seeing how that was going and then kind of being on the insides of it, like I have no ill will towards where I was at in my previous church. I love all those people still to this day. But it was being in that space and growing as a person, not knowing I was deconstructing already when I took that position, but then growing and viewing that. It really wasn't until 2020 when COVID started and George Floyd happened. So that was really hard. The response to COVID was, immediately very serious, and we took things very seriously. But then the longer that it went on, and as we got into 21, then the less serious name came around, and a gentleman who has since passed from COVID complications was kind of like gloating in COVID's face and like wearing like underwear as a mask, which was the whole thing. And, it rocked my world. And then the response to George Floyd and, kind of the unseriousness of how that was taken. Like, we mentioned it, but like we didn't really do anything about it. And like it was kind of like, we're going to pray for this and then like never talk about it again. And I was like, why are we not talking about this? Like this is the moment. And it was summer of 21. We took our first mission trip post-COVID with my youth students, and we went to Minneapolis. And we were going around we were supposed to be serving food to the homeless that day, but it turned out to be a horrible. This could be a podcast episode in itself, how awful this experience went. This guy who was running this ministry just completely took over this day and hijacked our situation, and we ended up going on like a bus tour of the city and seeing he was showing us the rummage that the looters caused in Minneapolis. And during that process, we learned that he was the police chaplain, also working in this homeless ministry. And keep in mind, my ministry I was running, we were in North County, Missouri, or in St. Louis. So, I had a lot of black and brown students in my youth ministry. We were the most diverse group in our entire church. So we were about split 50-50, and I was on the bus that just happened to have the majority of our African-American students on it, and they just couldn't believe like what they were witnessing because, while we were a very silent, accepting, and inclusive place compared to a Southern Baptist church, this guy was not. And thankfully, the company that we were working with that set up this mission experience for us allowed us to go and see the George Floyd Memorial, which was the most spiritual experience I think I've ever had in a church setting. We got off, and there's artwork and flowers and paintings, and it just was beautiful. And we met this guy who was running the garden there, who, had probably planted some marijuana because he was pretty high, but preached the gospel to our students.
Sure.
And I was just blown away. And I was like, this is the most beautiful experience. And I'm taking pictures, and I'm, my kids are like fighting back tears because this, like, even my white students are just like, this is what it's about. Like, we went through this really hard thing that none of us were appreciative of, and we made it here. So like, praise God that we're here. And I posted those pictures on our church youth Instagram page. And I got back home, and I immediately had to have a meeting with our senior pastors. Like, there were a few parents and church members that were furious that I took my kids to the George Floyd Memorial, and that I was idolizing Black Lives Matter, and that I wasn't preaching the gospel. And I had to have these conversations, and I was like, this is where I saw Jesus work, and this is like, you don't understand how much this meant to our kids. And they just was fought back, and I was like, what? This church that I love,
that's hard,
is saying that, like, how is this not it? And so that, and because of that, then I started to read books like Jesus and John Wayne and all these things, and I started to learn vocabulary for deconstruction. But man, like, I couldn't believe it. And so it was those last 2.5 years that I had in ministry were just brutal. And like, the only thing that kept me going back to that place were those kids, and anything else I honestly couldn't have cared less about, because it was just that moment. Like, at that point I was like, I know for a fact now you don't care about me and you don't care about these kids. You just care about what we're projecting, and what we're projecting isn't right.
Yeah, and what you're preserving. Like, they wanted to preserve
exactly
what they knew to be true. Yeah. Thank you both for sharing those things. I mean, I think your guys' stories are equal parts unique because they're your stories, but also, like, I bet you there are people listening that are like, man, I hear a sliver of myself in that story.
Oh, 100%. Yeah.
But one thing I'm always and I don't think I've ever asked this on the podcast before, but one thing that I'm always trying to be aware of is, like, we sit in unique seats as pastors.
Yeah.
Also, we're 3 white pastors. And one of the things that we have tried to do is like not only have like straight white guys on the podcast.
That's the hope, yeah.
Yeah, and this is like the straightest and whitest it's ever been, probably.
I'm so sorry to taint your image.
Sorry, man.
But we have an opportunity in that to talk about it. And so, what do you think our blind spots are as pastors navigating deconstruction with people that aren't pastors? Because like we've gone through our own journey. But what do you think we miss, like, as the people on the other side of the table? And I would say, I mean, I think we probably all agree there's not a dividing line, but sometimes there feels like there is. And just a reality of we see the world from different glasses just based on our seat at the table.
Yeah.
But what do you think we miss?
Well, we've been talking a bit about some of the stuff. We've been having some conversations here at Concord about like the best way, the most efficient way that we communicate out certain ideas and shifts in vision and that kind of stuff. And
like to the congregation.
Yeah. And one of the things that our lead pastor has said a lot is like, we'll say something, we'll announce something, we'll bring something out into the open, and we'll get pushback from it or whatever, and and it's like it's real easy to get frustrated because it's like you've invested a lot of time and whatever it says. And he's like, you have to remember, we've been talking about this for 6 months. This is the first time they're ever hearing this, right?
Yeah.
And so, in a similar vein, pastors, at least, thinking about pastors in the UMC, those of us that went through seminary training or have undergrad degrees in ministry or whatever, we had devoted a significant amount of time, a significant chunk of our lives to the academic study of the Bible and theology and our tradition. I'm in my 9th or 10th year of academic work in this, and it's like not everybody has. A lot of people that we have in our churches, the time that they devote to studying the Bible or to the Christian tradition is the hour that they give on Sundays to listening to our sermons and singing our hymns. And so it's like, I think at least part of what I had often struggled with and that I've had to get better at is just being patient with people who are, maybe they're trying to get there, or you see a little glimmer of like, they're interested in kind of this deconstructing work, or they have questions about it. And it's like, for me, I was able to go through that process largely because I was, I never got away from those conversations or those circles that were having those conversations.
Yeah.
And, the people around us, the people in our churches that were pastoring and were shepherding, they don't have that same reality. And so I think, the aspect of the time we devote and the way that we help people along, needs to be informed by that. And that's something that I've really, I didn't get my first couple of years of ministry. I was just like, what? Why aren't these people coming along? Like, this all makes a lot of sense to me, right? Like, why? Yeah. I don't know. And so eventually I realized, it makes a lot of sense to me because I've spent the last, almost decade figuring it out, whereas these people may have never interacted with this particular idea.
Yeah, and it's like I miss seminary sometimes, but not because of the academics as much as like the all-encompassing relational aspect of it. Of like I was in the trenches with these people having these conversations, and I almost wonder, it's like, how do we create those opportunities? Like maybe that's more of an indictment of the church, right? Like we're not creating as much community and safe places for disagreement, dialogue, and learning. But I think it's interesting, like as people that like go to school for this, it's like it's this in front of us, right? Like you see the financial bros on TikTok. It's like they're talking about it because it's all in front of them all the time, right? Yeah. And they're like, well, why don't you understand that if you put down this much and this, and like, it's like, well, I'm not in it right now.
Right.
And it's like, we're the same way. We're like Theo bros, right? Like theology bros in that kind of world.
You love that. You love that phrase.
Disgusting.
Yeah, it's a bad phrase. But unfortunately, it's who we are. Right.
Right.
Even when we try not to be. And so but that's an interesting one. That's a good like blind spot to see. Do you have a different one?
Yeah. I mean, I think, the biggest thing that, the majority of, white men, let alone white male pastors, just fail to do is listen and ask questions. Like, I grew up just not being able to ask questions about scripture. And then if I did, then even if the person I was talking to didn't know the answer, they would try to make up an answer. So like I've made that like my life's calling. Like if I have a student or somebody come up to me and ask, and you were kind of talking about this too, like if you have somebody who doesn't know an answer to it, like I'm going to look at you and say, I don't know. Like I'm willing to dig in and do the work with you. And we may not find it, but like I don't know. And I'm not going to sit here and pretend to you like I do know.
Yeah.
But with that allows for really interesting dialogue, and you can have really interesting conversations. Like I had this, I'll never forget this. One of my favorite students at my last church just had this passage. I think it was in 2 Kings, and it was about like chariots and this army that was going and blah. I mean, it just was on the surface like this just complete nonsense passage of scripture. I was like, what is like Joey, why do you care about what this means? He's like, I don't know. Like, and then like I just like pushed it off for like 4 months. I was like, this clearly means nothing. Like, whatever.
It's in the Bible.
He's gonna forget about it. And he brought it up to me like 4 months later. Like, did you ever look into this? And I was like, oh, no. Let's sit down and do it right now. And we found out like it genuinely was just like a historical context in scripture. Like there was no like spiritual weight behind it. It was just doing what the Old Testament does sometimes, like going through history. He was like, "Oh, okay, that's really cool."
Yeah,
I was like, "Okay." So like, I refused to listen to this kid for a minute. 'Cause I was like, this just on the surface just didn't look like he was important, but like, it like was eating at him for 4 months to where he
him, right?
exactly. And I was like, "Oh, okay, I need to do better at that."
Yeah.
Well, and I think like there's blind spots to being right. I mean, like, we could layer this as much as we want. Like there's blind spots to being pastors, and there's blind spots to being white male pastors, and which adds more of like. We don't get the same kind of flack that our female pastoral colleagues get, or our friends that are pastors of color, or our LGBTQ pastor friends. And it's like I think making a conscious effort, both as pastoral leaders, but just as people of faith and people of conscience who are committed to doing work of justice, is like trying to foresee, trying to get around those blind spots as much as we can to be empathetic and to stand in solidarity with our friends that are struggling with this stuff. And I think that's a a deconstruction all its own. Like I inherited a specific set of ideas around LGBTQ people, and we had talked about this as a staff not long ago. But it's like, or maybe it was at our small group, our co-op that we have here, is like, I grew up, being taught that, there was racism in America, and then MLK gave a speech, and then there was no more racism, right? Or that like white people invented everything but peanut butter. Like that's what I was taught in school, And so it's like that kind of
Jesus was white.
Jesus was white. Yeah, like that kind of received history is like, that's a whole deconstruction all its own that does in very real ways add into our faith and our faith journeys, but has ramifications far reaching outside of it.
Yeah.
So we just recorded an episode, and I can't remember if I said this already within this episode, but we had recorded an episode of your guys' podcast, the Progressive Pastor Podcast. Had a ton of fun doing that, but my favorite part of it was the last question you asked, and I want to ask it to you guys, because I don't think you guys asked it to me.
Oh, yeah.
But the question was like, what keeps you coming back, right? That was the question.
Yeah.
And you guys asked it to me in terms of like ministry, right? Like there are things that are hard and things. And so why do you keep coming back maybe when all things are going to shit around you or whatever?
Yeah.
But for you guys, like whether it's, well, actually, if you can try to distill it to deconstruction, like, because this is a hard journey of like reconstructing, deconstructing a world that doesn't understand it, a world where you appear to be a heretic, all the things that are hard. Like what keeps you coming back to ministry and to seeing the positives of deconstruction within your just own life?
Yeah. I mean, I feel like my answer is going to kind of mirror yours. I recently had lunch or dinner with a friend who, during my undergrad days, like I would have considered one of my best friends. And it was like, it ended up just being like this like 3-hour kind of grill session about like, why are you a Methodist now? And like, why'd you leave the Baptist church? And,
You've gone woke.
Exactly. Yeah. He describes me as his woke friend to all of his, Southern Baptist friends. And I'm like, sick, like badge of honor, but like, whatever. But like,
you don't know how happy that makes me.
exactly. I'm like, man, I'm really doing good. But like, I left that dinner and I was just so upset. Like, I wasn't like sad, but I was like, what is like, why do you not get it? And I was like, I still read and preach the same gospel that you preach, and like, I believe what you believe. It's just like, I just love gay people, like sue me, like and like, I don't believe that being gay is the same. Like how are we that different?
Yeah.
And so I got home and I'm like, I'm just complaining to my wife for like an hour. I'm like just trying to give her the snippets of this 3-hour grill session that I was a part of, that like I just couldn't believe happened. And I got to the end of it and I was like, hold on, this is what I was hoping for, right? Like, for these people that were so deeply entrenched into this world that I was deeply entrenched in, to even be able to have a conversation at the table. And even though like, he didn't walk out of that dinner, on the same mind path that I was, if you would have asked me, 10 years ago, I would have been on the other side of that table, and doing the same thing to my quote unquote woke friends before I started to kind of move into a more progressive theology and just general mindset. And so I was like, hold on, I think this is the right thing. And so for me, there's a large element of hope that like, I don't get viewed as this heretic all the time. Like, I want this to become the normalcy of the American church. Like, I want to see this become a widespread movement into all of our churches today. I also want to. I say I want to see people get humbled, but like not like in a negative context of like I'm gonna stomp you into the ground and humble you, but like I was humbled in the same way.
Yeah.
And just to see, our LGBTQ and our Black and brown and our women in ministry, like as their true neighbors, as Jesus described them, and just be able to love them well, like that's it for me.
I dig that. I think people should be mocked all the time for this, but I'm going to lift mine up. But my Instagram bio is preaching the radical gospel until it's not radical anymore. And I do hear that in what you're saying a little bit. Like you want the normal to be inclusion, right? You want the normal to be that. And it's like that friend did trust you to some degree to have that conversation, even if it's a seed you planted. But 5 years down the road, that's an exciting conversation to think about having. Of like he recalls, or she, was it he recalls your conversation and being like, oh man, like I remember getting dinner with you and I thought you were a huge idiot, but then like God did something in me and now I don't think you're as much of an idiot. And then a year down from there, right? Like
exactly,
like God can really use that, and that's a cool perspective shift too, because I don't think we always get there.
No, and like maybe call me a huge like optimist, but like that's where I'm at.
Yeah, I like that.
I still think you're a huge idiot.
Thanks, thanks, Boo.
Well, yeah, you got it.
What's yours, JT?
Well, yeah. So when we first started, you were talking about how you and Kyle are both kind of heart people, and I'm kind of an academic guy, and I think there's a lot of truth to that. And my approach to academic work, I think, is the same to my approach to ministry and my approach to deconstruction. Is I'm deeply invested and interested in this type of work insofar as it aids in the task of liberation and justice for oppressed people in the world. And so, insofar as academics are helpful to that task, insofar as, and I, the thing that keeps me up at night is thinking about what if all of the Christians in the world, what if every church in the world was activated toward that work of liberation and justice? What a different world this would be, right? And so, thinking about like my own deconstruction journey and the people around me that have gone through this, it is only and maybe for other people they haven't had this experience, but for me, I've only seen journeys of deconstruction lead people to be more inclusive and more loving and more justice oriented and liberation minded. And so for me, what keeps me coming back to this work is this idea and this dream, which in a very fundamental way is the dream of the gospel, right? That another world is possible, that a different world, that we're not stuck with this world that we have, that there can be movement and there can be progress, and we can make an unjust world a little less unjust. And I think, at least in my experience, my own journey of deconstruction, both in my faith and my deconstruction around my concept of social issues and justice issues, has aided in my work and my calling to that task. And so I can only hope and dream that, I can play a small part in the people in my church and the people in my sphere to jump on that journey as well.
Yeah, I dig it. And I also say you got a hard time by saying you're an academic and not a hard person, because in a sense, like, if justice is your issue, like, that's a hard issue, right? Like, and like, you care about people at a deep level, and so
you do care. Look at you.
I got kind of like my heart's growing 3
Yeah.
sizes right
Look
now.
at that.
Yeah, so proud of you.
Thanks, man.
Well, man, I appreciate you guys taking the time to do this. I
Absolutely.
not
It's
only
super fun.
would love to be back on your guys' podcast again, but I think it'd be fun to just continue to revisit some of these conversations with you guys.
Yeah.
Just because I think it is important to hear a diversity of opinions and a diversity of thoughts, and from the head and from the heart, and from churches that are established to churches that are new. Like, people hear from me a lot on the Deconstruction, obviously, like, it's our podcast, but like, you guys are in a way different church context. So Deconstruction in your pews looks different than it does in our seats, right?
Sure.
And so it's like, how do we
What's it like to say
understand that?
seats in that pews?
Oh,
man, really
man.
rubbing it in our face, Danny.
What-
Do you guys have pews?
Sadly.
what we would give to have seats and not pews.
We actually have talked about how cool it would be to have pews.
You want some? I know
trade?
where you
You
can
wanna
get some.
trade?
That's always greener. But I appreciate you guys joining us, and our send off is always to embrace the journey, understanding that wherever people are is where they are. And like, I think I said this in my sermon this Sunday. Is like, when we pray to God, like, we should pray where we actually are, not where we're pretending to be.
Ooh,
And
that'll preach.
Yeah, it will, right? And I think that's what part of embracing the journey is, like, just own where you're at,
Nice.
and take that step. And so I thank you guys for being with us. And I should have prepped you before this. We're all going to try to snap at the same time after I say embrace the journey. So I'm going to say it, and then you're going to snap with me.
Here we go.
But hey, thank you guys for joining us, and we invite you to embrace the journey. That was pretty good.
Look at that.
Ooh.